Somewhere in the sandstone valleys of northern Arabia, there are homes carved directly into solid rock, and no living hand remembers carving them. Somewhere in the deep sands of southern Arabia, satellites once photographed the faint outline of ancient roads, all converging on a single point in the desert, a point where a city used to stand, and then simply did not. Two civilizations, two nations that built like nothing could ever touch them. And one book, written 14 centuries ago, that named them both, described exactly how they lived, and described exactly how they ended, long before a single archaeologist ever lifted a shovel to that sand. This is the story of Ad and Thamud, the two nations the Qur'an holds up as the very first case studies in what happens when human power convinces itself it has no limits. And this is also the story of what modern excavation, radar imaging, and inscriptions cut into stone have actually found in the places where these two nations are said to have lived, tested against the record left behind 1,400 years ago. Here is the detail that should stop you before we go any further. The Quran does not treat Ad and Thamud as folklore, tucked safely away with no fixed address, the way a fable needs no real coordinates. It treats them as real nations, in real valleys, whose ruins the very first people to hear this revelation could travel to and stand inside. Merchant caravans moving between Arabia and the Levant passed directly through what had once been Thamud's territory. The Prophet Muhammad himself once stood among their ruins and gave his companions specific instructions about how to behave there. That is not the language of legend. That is the language of a claim about a real place, a real people, and a real ending. The kind of claim that can actually be tested. So, let's test it. To understand who Ad and Thamud were, we first need to understand the world that produced them. Long before Mecca was a trading town, long before Arabia meant much of anything to the outside world, the peninsula was crossed by nations whose names survive today mainly because scripture, poetry, and a handful of inscriptions refused to let them vanish entirely. Classical Arabian tradition even has a name for tribes like this: Al-Arab al-Ba'ida, the vanished Arabs. Peoples so completely erased from the historical record that later genealogists could not trace a single living descendant back to them, unlike the remaining Arabs, whose bloodlines carried forward into the tribes of the Prophet's own era. Ad and Thamud sit at the very top of that list, and they were not alone. Early Arabian tradition also preserves the names of other vanished peoples, Tazim and Jadis among them, tribes remembered mainly through poetry and fragments of tribal memory, rather than any sustained scriptural narrative. What separates Ad and Thamud from that wider, hazier catalog of lost nations is precision. The Quran does not simply note that they existed and then disappeared. It names their prophets, records their arguments, quotes their objections, and locates their ruins with enough specificity that later generations could travel there and recognize the very ground beneath their feet. In the Quran's telling, both were given a warning first, delivered by someone who had every reason to know exactly how it would be received. Classical historians, including Ibn Kathir and Al-Tabari, treated this distinction seriously, filing Ad and Thamud away not as parables, but as extinct civilizations, complete with rough chronology, geography, and cause of collapse, the way a modern historian might catalog a vanished empire. The Quran itself keeps returning to them, pairing Ad and Thamud together across more than a dozen surahs, including At-Tawbah, Ibrahim, Al-Furqan, Al-Ankabut, Sad, Kaf, An-Najm, and Al-Haqqah. almost always in the same breath as Pharaoh's Egypt and the people of Nu. 4 separate civilizations, treated as 4 parallel factual case studies, not literary devices unique to Arabian storytelling. Ad came first, placed by the Qur'an and by early Muslim historians in the generations after the Great Flood of Prophet Nu. In a southern stretch of Arabia, the Qur'an names directly Al-Akaf, the wind-carved dunes, somewhere in the direction of modern Yemen and Oman. Thamud arrived later, after Ad's downfall, settling in the rocky uplands of the northern Hijaz, in a valley the sources call Al-Hijr, sitting directly on the trade corridor linking Arabia to the Levant. 2 nations, 2 regions, 2 completely different landscapes, and 1 identical arc. Extraordinary prosperity, extraordinary architecture, and a warning that was rejected until rejecting it was no longer an option.
What made both nations remarkable was never wickedness in some vague, abstract sense. It was achievement. Ad is described as a people of immense physical stature and construction ability, builders of towering structures unmatched anywhere else in that era. Thamud, generations later, did something arguably even more astonishing. They carved entire homes directly into mountainsides, turning raw stone into architecture with a level of skill and confidence that left them, in the Quran's own words, feeling secure inside the mountains they had made their own. These were not primitive tribes scraping by in the desert. These were 2 of the most technically accomplished societies in the ancient Arabian world. And that is exactly the point the Quran keeps circling back to. The danger was never poverty. The danger was mastery, mistaken for permanence. Both nations, the Quran insists, were not simply left to discover this the hard way. Each was sent someone first, a warning, before the warning became irreversible. To Ad was sent Hūd, described as their brother, a man from inside their own tribe, someone who spoke their dialect and understood exactly what he was walking into. Surah Hūd, Surah Al-Araf, and Surah Ash-Shu'ara all preserve versions of the confrontation, and the pattern across each is strikingly consistent. Hūd tells them plainly that their wealth, their monumental buildings on every high point of land, their fortresses built as though they might live forever, would not save them from what was coming if they refused to turn back toward the one God who had given them everything they had. Their response, recorded in Surah Ash-Shu'ara, is almost unnervingly casual. They tell him it makes no difference whether he preaches or stays silent, and dismiss the entire warning as nothing more than the old customs of earlier peoples repeating themselves. No dramatic villainy, just comfortable people, certain that their comfort was itself the proof they were fine. There is a moment in Surah Al-Akaf that most retellings skip past, and it is one of the most quietly devastating images in the entire Quran. Ad's people see a cloud approaching across the horizon of their valley, and instead of fear, they feel joy, mistaking it for the rain that would finally water their fields. Hūd tells them otherwise. This, he says, is the very punishment they had spent years daring him to bring faster. A community cheering the exact thing about to end them. The danger was never that Ad failed to notice what was coming. It was that they could no longer recognize it, even staring directly at it. The same surah preserves something that sounds almost uncomfortably modern. Hūd does not simply threaten a future punishment. He reminds his people, in verses carried in Surah Ash-Shu'ara, that Allah had given them cattle, sons, gardens, and springs, blessings they had quietly stopped experiencing as gifts and started treating as entitlements. It is a critique of prosperity that has been separated from gratitude,
delivered by a man who understood exactly how little it would cost his people to listen, and exactly how much it would cost him personally to keep speaking anyway. Generations later, in a different region entirely, a strikingly parallel figure appears. Salih, sent to Thamud, again described as their brother, again a man from inside the very community he was warning. But Thamud's story carries something Ad's does not, a detail specific enough to function almost as physical evidence, a sign. According to the Qur'an, Salih presented his people with a she-camel, described in Surah Al-Araf, Surah Hūd, and Surah Ash-Shams, as emerging from the earth itself as proof of his prophethood. And the terms attached to her were exact, almost contractual. She would drink from the community's water on one day. The people and their own herds would draw water the next. She was not to be harmed. One condition. That single condition became the hinge on which an entire nation's fate turned. The sign itself was not arbitrary. Classical commentary explains that Thamud's leadership, confronted by Salih, had specifically demanded that if he was truly a messenger, he should produce a pregnant she-camel from a particular rock formation in their mountain, believing they were setting him an impossible test designed to embarrass him into silence. According to the Qur'an, the camel emerged exactly as demanded. The sign they had chosen as a trap became the very proof they could not argue their way around, which is likely part of why her killing carried such catastrophic weight. This was not an animal harmed in a moment of carelessness. It was the deliberate destruction of the one piece of evidence Thamud's own leaders had insisted would settle the matter.
They broke it. Surah Ash-Shams, one of the shortest and most rhythmically charged chapters in the Qur'an, makes a point of not isolating the blame to a single man. It was not the whole tribe that swung the blade, but the tribe's collective approval that sealed its fate, an idea Islamic scholars have repeated for 14 centuries. An entire nation held responsible because an entire nation consented. Early commentary preserves the name of the man traditionally identified as the killer, but the deeper argument the Qur'an is making sits elsewhere. A crime carried out with a community's silent blessing becomes the community's crime. And before the killing even happened, the Qur'an preserves something that reads almost like transcribed conspiracy recorded in Surah An-Naml. Thamud's leadership, split into 9 factions actively spreading corruption across the land, plotted in secret to eliminate Salih and his household by night, so completely that his own relatives would find no proof and have no path to justice. This was not confusion. It was calculated, organized, and specifically engineered to erase accountability. According to the same surah, the plot collapsed only because Allah destroyed the plotters along with everyone else, turning the very scheme built to conceal a crime into permanent evidence, preserved in Scripture, of exactly who had planned it. Before we get to how it ended, sit with something the Qur'an does that almost no other text of comparable age even attempts. It gives a physical address. Surah Al-Hijr, the 15th chapter of the Qur'an, is literally named after the valley where Thamud lived, the rocky tract. Verse 80 states plainly that the people of Al-Hijr denied the messengers sent to them. This is not a floating once upon a time. It is a named location, a location still on modern maps, a location you can drive to today in the northwest of Saudi Arabia. Remember that name, Al-Hijr. We are coming back to it, because what archaeologists eventually found there, and what they very specifically did not find there, is one of the most honest stories in this entire investigation. Now, the endings. Ad's is described across multiple surahs with one recurring image: wind. Not an ordinary storm,
But according to Surah Al-Haqqa, a violently raging wind, unleashed for 7 consecutive nights and 8 relentless days, leaving its people scattered like the hollow trunks of uprooted palm trees. Surah Fusilat adds a detail that lands harder the longer you sit with it, describing that same wind as bitterly cold and shrieking, sent across days the Qur'an calls ill-omened, a disgrace deliberately matched to the scale of the arrogance that provoked it. Surah An-Najm compresses the entire event into a single brutal line. Ad, the first, was destroyed. Across every surah that touches this moment, the pattern holds. A catastrophic windstorm, sustained far longer than any ordinary storm, erasing a civilization famous for building the tallest structures anyone in that world had ever seen. Thamud's ending arrives faster and looks completely different. After the she-camel was killed, the Quran says the people were given exactly 3 days, described in Surah Hūd with a phrase that reads almost cruel in hindsight. Enjoy yourselves in your homes. When the 3 days ended, multiple surahs, including Al-Araf, Hūd, and Al-Qamar, converge on the same event described 2 related ways. A mighty blast or shout, as-sayha, and in places an earthquake, ar-rajfa. Surah Al-Qamar renders it in 7 words, comparing the sound to the trampling of dry, gathered twigs, and then nothing more. Thamud, a nation famous for feeling untouchably secure inside mountains of their own carving, was wiped out inside those very homes, at their own doorsteps, without ever leaving the security they had spent generations building with their own hands. So here's the question a serious documentary has to ask directly, instead of tiptoeing around it. Is any of this something history and archaeology can actually confirm? Or are we just repeating scripture and calling repetition evidence? The honest answer splits into 2 very different investigations, one in northern Arabia, one deep in the south, and each rests on a completely different quality of evidence. Start in the north, in the valley the Quran itself names, Al-Hijr. Today the site carries a more famous modern name, Mada'in Salih, the cities of Salih, near the town of AlUla in northwestern Saudi Arabia. In 2008, it became the first site in the entire kingdom ever inscribed on the UNESCO World Heritage List. And this is exactly where the story gets genuinely complicated, in the most interesting way possible. The monumental structures that draw visitors today, more than 100 elaborately carved tombs cut straight into towering sandstone outcrops, were not built by Thamud. The epigraphic record is clear on this.
Why did a valley in the middle of nowhere become valuable enough for 2 civilizations to fight over across 1,000 years? Follow the road it sat on. This corridor, the incense route, carried frankincense and myrrh from the southern Arabian coastline all the way north to Mediterranean markets, and controlling a reliable water source anywhere along it meant controlling serious wealth. Ancient populations resettled the same valleys their predecessors chose for a simple reason. Water, shelter, and trade access almost never move. A location good enough for Thamud to carve homes into more than 1,000 years before Islam was, for identical reasons, good enough for the Nabateans to fortify centuries later, and good enough for the Prophet's own army to camp in on the road to Tabuk centuries after that. The valley's value never disappeared. Only its occupants did, again and again. This is exactly the kind of detail that gets flattened in both directions if you're not careful. It would be dishonest to claim the carved facades tourists photograph today are literally Thamud's ruins. The inscriptions don't support that. But it would be equally dishonest to conclude the Quran's account has no connection to this physical site at all. The truth sits in between.
Islamic tradition, preserved from the earliest companions onward, consistently identifies this exact valley as Ard Thamud, the land of Thamud, and Beit Thamud, the house of Thamud, occupied centuries before the Nabateans ever arrived. Some historians who have studied the region's inscriptions in depth propose that the name Thamud was later carried forward by the populations that resettled the same valley, precisely because the older name had become permanently welded to that landscape. The valley itself carries a continuous thread of memory, even though the monuments visible today belong to a much later chapter of its story. Walk through the site today, and the Nabatean layer speaks loudly for itself. Archaeologists have identified individual tombs by name, including one belonging to a Nabatean woman named Hinat, whose elaborate facade and inscriptions indicate she held significant social standing. Private tombs at Hegra were reserved for the wealthy and prominent. Nearby, a natural cleft in the rock called the Seek opens into a larger sanctuary at Jebel Ithlib, where altars and niches cut into unhewn cliff faces once served as a place of worship for the Nabatean deity Dushara. All of it is genuine, all of it is extraordinary, and none of it is Thamud. It belongs to a civilization that arrived at this valley roughly 2,000 years after the Qur'an says Salih's people were destroyed there. But there's a second, quieter layer of evidence at Al-Hijr that almost never makes it into the highlight reel, and it might be the more important one. Alongside the Nabatean tombs, the site preserves roughly 50 inscriptions and cave drawings that predate the Nabatean period entirely. Inscripts UNESCO's own documentation labels Thamudic, alongside Lihyanite and other early North Arabian scripts. Epigraphers use Thamudic as a broad label for a family of ancient inscriptions scattered widely across Arabia, not necessarily proof of one unified tribe in the way later tradition understood it, and serious scholars are upfront that the connection is debated. But its presence at exactly the valley the Quran names, buried beneath a civilization that arrived centuries afterward, is not nothing. It is a fragment of a far older Arabian past, physically sitting in the ground, at the address the Quran gave. And then comes the detail that turns this from an archaeological footnote into something close to a documented historical event. The Prophet Muhammad himself walking through that exact valley. In the year 630, during the expedition to Tabuk, authentic hadith recorded in both Sahih al-Bukhari and Sahih Muslim describe the Muslim army camping directly at Al-Hijr. Companions, including Abdullah ibn Umar, narrate that when some of the men drew water from the local wells to knead their bread, the Prophet ordered every trace of it discarded, the water and the dough alike, feeding it to the animals instead, and redirected the army toward a separate well, traditionally tied to the she-camel. He told his companions not to enter the ruined dwellings of a destroyed people unless they entered weeping, warning that the same fate could still reach them. Then, according to the narration, he pulled his cloak over his face and quickened his pace until the entire army had crossed the valley. This is not vague oral tradition, softened by centuries of retelling. This is a specific, multiply narrated, chain-verified account of history's most documented figure, treating this valley as the real, physical, cursed ground of a real nation 6 centuries after the Nabateans had already come and gone.
A second narration from that same expedition, preserved by Imam Ahmad and cited by Ibn Kathir, sharpens the detail even further. The Prophet stops at the well associated with the she-camel and tells his companions not to go asking for miraculous signs the way Thamud once had, pointing toward the specific point in the mountain where tradition says she emerged. Whatever conclusion you draw from the theological content, the historical value here is significant. This is a man treating Thamud's story not as distant legend, but as local geography, precise enough to point at one rock formation in front of an army of thousands and describe exactly what had allegedly happened there. The valley's afterlife did not end with the Prophet's army either. Centuries later, the wider region containing Al-Hijr, known to Arab geographers as Wadi al-Qura, the Valley of Villages, became famous in a completely different context, as the setting of one of classical Arabic literature's most celebrated love stories, immortalized in the verses of the poet Jamil ibn Mamar. A landscape once named directly by the Qur'an as the site of a nation's destruction went on to become, in later centuries, a byword for longing and devotion in Arabic poetry. It is a strange kind of continuity, one destruction narrative and one love story sharing the exact same coordinates on a map, separated by little more than the passage of time and the changing preoccupations of the people who kept returning there. Now we travel south into one of the most hostile landscapes on Earth, for a story that unfolds less like careful archaeology and more like a detective case that took 2,000 years to close. Ad's homeland sits, according to the Qur'an, near Al-Akaf, the wind-sculpted dunes, generally placed by classical geographers across what is now southern Yemen and the Dhofar province of Oman. Somewhere in that region stands one of the most quoted verses connected to Ad anywhere in the Qur'an, from Surah Al-Fajr. Iram, of the pillars, whose like was never built anywhere else in the land. For centuries, Iram was pure legend, a phantom city whispered about by medieval geographers and poets, sometimes called Ubar, said to have glittered with wealth from the frankincense trade before the sands swallowed it whole as punishment for its people's pride. British officer T.E. Lawrence, better known as Lawrence of Arabia, became personally obsessed with the rumor, convinced an ancient Arab civilization lay buried somewhere beneath the Rub al-Khali, the empty quarter, one of the driest and most punishing deserts on the planet. He never found it. Neither did anyone else for the next 70 years, though not for lack of trying. British explorer Bertram Thomas marked a suspected caravan track leading toward the legend on a map in the 1930s, but was never able to follow it. Wilfred Thesiger visited the well at Shizr in 1946 and described nothing more than the ruins of a crude stone fort standing over the water. St. John Philby, chasing the same rumor with the same hunger for glory, found instead what he first believed were the ruins of a lost city and later concluded was an ancient meteorite impact crater half buried in sand. Every serious explorer who touched this legend across half a century came away with fragments, a track, a fort, a crater, but never the city itself. Then, in the early 1990s, the search stopped happening on foot and started happening from orbit. A team led by American filmmaker and amateur archaeologist Nicholas Clapp, alongside explorer Sir Ranulph Fiennes and archaeologist Dr. Joris Zarins, used NASA satellite imagery, including radar capable of tracing faint marks beneath desert sand, to follow ancient caravan routes invisible to the naked eye, but permanently etched into the landscape by millennia of camel traffic. Every route converged on the same point, a long-known well called Shizr in Oman's Dhofar province. When the team started digging in 1992, they doubted this modest site could really be the legendary Ubar. Then the ground told them otherwise. Beneath the sand sat a large, fortified structure described as octagonal, ringed by high walls and multiple towers,
some accounts counting as many as 8, all built around what had once been the site's critical water source. And then they found the reason the legend of a city swallowed by the earth had survived 2,000 years intact. At the center of the fortress sat a massive sinkhole. Geological analysis revealed the entire structure had been built directly above an underground limestone cavern, hollowed out over centuries by water moving beneath the surface. As the water table dropped, likely accelerated by the very irrigation the settlement depended on, the cavern could no longer hold the weight above it, and a significant portion of the fortress collapsed straight down into the earth. Not myth.
A documented, geologically explainable catastrophe, and precisely the kind of ground swallows the city event that oral tradition across Arabia had been describing for well over 1,000 years before anyone understood the science of collapsing limestone. What the excavators pulled out of the ground alongside the fortress only reinforced how far this outpost's reach once extended. Pottery decorated with a distinctive dot and circle motif, unique to this stretch of Arabia, sat buried next to Roman glassware and pearls carried across the Indian Ocean, physical proof of a trading network stretching from the Mediterranean to South Asia, all funneled through a single desert well. This was never an isolated settlement clinging to survival at the edge of the empty quarter. For a period of centuries, it was a node the ancient world's luxury economy genuinely depended on, which makes its sudden collapse into the earth all the more striking as a historical event, whatever name history eventually settles on for it. Here's where honesty demands we slow down again, because the popular version of the story ran far ahead of what the evidence actually supports. When the New York Times splashed "Lost City of Ubar Found" across its front page in 1992, the announcement sounded far more certain than the archaeology itself. Serious scholarship on Shisfer has grown considerably more cautious since. Later excavation and comparative regional study suggests the site was likely not a sprawling city in the way legend imagined Ubar, but a single fortified outpost, part of a wider network of desert caravanserais, supporting the frankincense trade across a region the ancient geographer Ptolemy labeled the land of the Iobarite. Some researchers now read Ubar as referring to a region or a tribal confederation, rather than one specific city, an interpretation that actually lines up neatly with how the Qur'an itself uses the word Iram, a term Islamic scholars have long debated as meaning a city, a tribe, or a territory, not necessarily one fixed point on a map. And there is a serious rival candidate for Iram that deserves equal time, because a documentary that only shows you evidence supporting a single conclusion is not documenting anything. It is advocating. A significant body of scholars, working from inscriptions rather than satellite data, place Iram not in Oman at all, but far to the north in Wadi Rum in southern Jordan. Ancient Safavidic inscriptions found there explicitly reference both the name Iram and the tribal name Ad, an identification proposed by medieval Arab geographers centuries before satellites existed. Both sites, Shisfer in the deep south and Wadi Rum in the north, sit within regions long associated with tribal memory of Ad, and neither claim has achieved full scholarly consensus. What can honestly be said is this: the physical, geological record confirms a real, sudden, catastrophic destruction event, consistent in character with what the Quran and pre-Islamic legend both independently describe, occurred at an ancient desert trading settlement somewhere in this broader region. Exactly where Iram of the Pillars once stood remains, appropriately, one of the genuinely open questions in Arabian archaeology. This is a good place to name the misconceptions that have quietly attached themselves to this story,
because both nations have accumulated popular claims that go well beyond what either the religious or archaeological evidence actually supports. The first, that the beautiful, ornately carved tombs tourists visit at Mada'in Salih today are literal photographs of Thamud's civilization. They are not. They are Nabatean funerary architecture, built centuries after the Quranic account places Thamud's destruction, and treating them as snapshots of Salih's people, however striking the image, is historically inaccurate. The second misconception runs in the opposite direction entirely, that because the visible monuments are Nabatean, the whole Thamud narrative has therefore been disproven. It has not. The valley's name, its pre-Nabatean Thamudic inscriptions, its consistent identification across more than 1,000 years of Arab and Islamic scholarship, and its explicit treatment as Thamud's homeland in chain-verified hadith describing the Prophet's own journey through it, all point toward genuine continuity of memory tied to a real place, even if the specific structures visible today came later. The third concerns Ubar and Iram directly. The assumption, fed by breathless 1990s headlines, that a single golden lost city has now been conclusively matched to the Quran with total certainty. What the evidence actually supports is more modest and, honestly, more interesting. A real catastrophic collapse at a real ancient trading outpost in a region long tied to Ad, sitting alongside a legitimate rival identification hundreds of miles away.
A documented, geologically explainable catastrophe, and precisely the kind of ground swallows the city event that oral tradition across Arabia had been describing for well over 1,000 years before anyone understood the science of collapsing limestone. What the excavators pulled out of the ground alongside the fortress only reinforced how far this outpost's reach once extended. Pottery decorated with a distinctive dot and circle motif, unique to this stretch of Arabia, sat buried next to Roman glassware and pearls carried across the Indian Ocean, physical proof of a trading network stretching from the Mediterranean to South Asia, all funneled through a single desert well. This was never an isolated settlement clinging to survival at the edge of the empty quarter. For a period of centuries, it was a node the ancient world's luxury economy genuinely depended on, which makes its sudden collapse into the earth all the more striking as a historical event, whatever name history eventually settles on for it. Here's where honesty demands we slow down again, because the popular version of the story ran far ahead of what the evidence actually supports. When the New York Times splashed "Lost City of Ubar Found" across its front page in 1992, the announcement sounded far more certain than the archaeology itself. Serious scholarship on Shisfer has grown considerably more cautious since. Later excavation and comparative regional study suggests the site was likely not a sprawling city in the way legend imagined Ubar, but a single fortified outpost, part of a wider network of desert caravanserais, supporting the frankincense trade across a region the ancient geographer Ptolemy labeled the land of the Iobarite. Some researchers now read Ubar as referring to a region or a tribal confederation, rather than one specific city, an interpretation that actually lines up neatly with how the Quran itself uses the word Iram, a term Islamic scholars have long debated as meaning a city, a tribe, or a territory, not necessarily one fixed point on a map. And there is a serious rival candidate for Iram that deserves equal time, because a documentary that only shows you evidence supporting a single conclusion is not documenting anything. It is advocating. A significant body of scholars, working from inscriptions rather than satellite data, place Iram not in Oman at all, but far to the north in Wadi Rum in southern Jordan. Ancient Safavidic inscriptions found there explicitly reference both the name Iram and the tribal name Ad,
an identification proposed by medieval Arab geographers centuries before satellites existed. Both sites, Shisfar in the deep south and Wadi Rum in the north, sit within regions long associated with tribal memory of Ad, and neither claim has achieved full scholarly consensus. What can honestly be said is this: the physical, geological record confirms a real, sudden, catastrophic destruction event, consistent in character with what the Qur'an and pre-Islamic legend both independently describe, occurred at an ancient desert trading settlement somewhere in this broader region. Exactly where Iram of the Pillars once stood remains, appropriately, one of the genuinely open questions in Arabian archaeology. This is a good place to name the misconceptions that have quietly attached themselves to this story, because both nations have accumulated popular claims that go well beyond what either the religious or archaeological evidence actually supports. The first, that the beautiful, ornately carved tombs tourists visit at Mada'in Salih today are literal photographs of Thamud's civilization. They are not. They are Nabatean funerary architecture, built centuries after the Quranic account places Thamud's destruction, and treating them as snapshots of Salih's people, however striking the image, is historically inaccurate. The second misconception runs in the opposite direction entirely, that because the visible monuments are Nabatean, the whole Thamud narrative has therefore been disproven. It has not. The valley's name, its pre-Nabatean Thamudic inscriptions, its consistent identification across more than 1,000 years of Arab and Islamic scholarship, and its explicit treatment as Thamud's homeland in chain-verified hadith describing the Prophet's own journey through it, all point toward genuine continuity of memory tied to a real place, even if the specific structures visible today came later. The third concerns Ubar and Iram directly. The assumption, fed by breathless 1990s headlines, that a single golden lost city has now been conclusively matched to the Quran with total certainty. What the evidence actually supports is more modest and, honestly, more interesting. A real catastrophic collapse at a real ancient trading outpost in a region long tied to Ad, sitting alongside a legitimate rival identification hundreds of miles away.
The goal of honest history is never to make the evidence more dramatic than it actually is. It's worth noticing how misconceptions like these usually get started, because the pattern repeats itself constantly. Enthusiasm outruns evidence. A striking photograph of a Nabatean tomb becomes a Thamud house because it makes a better thumbnail. A 1992 headline declares a lost city found because possible fortified outpost consistent with regional trade legend doesn't sell newspapers. This is not unique to Islamic history. The same shortcut happens in coverage of Troy, of Atlantis theories, of biblical archaeology across the Levant. The fix is always identical. Read the inscriptions, read the excavation reports, and let the geography speak before the headline does. So where does that leave us, once the noise clears and we ask what serious historians, epigraphers, and archaeologists actually agree on? A few things stand out. First, Ad and Thamud were never confined to religious memory alone. Both names appear independently in the Arabian epigraphic and geographic record, in inscriptions and classical sources, with no theological reason to invent them. Second, the northern valley the Quran calls Al-Hijr is a real, continuously identified location with a documented, layered occupation history running from a pre-Nabatean Thamudic presence through Nabatean, Roman, and eventually Islamic-era use, exactly matching how the Quran and Hadith both describe a real place that later travelers, including the Prophet himself, could recognize by name. Third, the deep southern region historically linked to Ad
shows genuine evidence of a sophisticated, wealthy trading civilization built on the frankincense economy, one that experienced a documented, sudden, geologically explainable collapse consistent in character, if not in every specific detail, with the Quran's description. And fourth, the exact identification of every ruin with every verse remains, appropriately, an open scholarly question rather than settled fact, which is precisely the kind of honesty a serious documentary owes its audience, instead of manufacturing certainty in either direction. There is one more thread worth pulling before we get to what all of this actually means. If Ad and Thamud flourished across the vast stretch of time the Quran describes, generations after Nuh's flood on one end, directly preceding the era of Ibrahim on the other, why doesn't the wider ancient world's written record, Mesopotamian, Egyptian, or otherwise, mention them the way it mentions other Near Eastern powers? The honest answer is that ancient Arabia as a whole remains dramatically underdocumented compared to its neighbors. Mesopotamia and Egypt left behind durable clay tablets and monumental inscriptions because those civilizations relied on centralized written record-keeping for taxation, law, and administration. Much of pre-Islamic Arabia ran on tribal, oral, and trade-based systems that left far sparser physical traces, and huge stretches of the peninsula, including much of the desert associated with Ad, remain among the least excavated regions on Earth, partly from sheer difficulty of terrain, and partly because sustained, systematic excavation across Saudi Arabia only began in earnest within the last few decades. An absence of outside documentation is not unusual here. It's close to the expected pattern, and it's exactly why every new excavation season in AlUla and every fresh satellite pass over the empty quarter still carries the potential to add real, physical weight to a story that, until recently, existed almost entirely in scripture and inherited memory. Islamic scholarship has drawn a further lesson from the way these two nations are always paired, one that goes beyond simple chronology. Ad is consistently linked to height, immense stature, towering buildings, structures the Quran says had no equal anywhere in the land. Thamud is consistently linked to depth, homes cut into the interior of mountains, security sought not by building upward, but by carving inward. Classical commentators, including Al-Qurtubi, noted that between them, these two nations represent the full range of human strategies for chasing permanence through architecture, reaching toward the sky and burrowing into the earth, and that destroying both by forces suited precisely to their chosen strategy, wind against height, a ground-shaking blast against depth, was no accident. It was, in this reading, a deliberate symmetry, built to make the lesson impossible to dismiss as coincidence. Whichever direction human beings choose to build their sense of security, the argument runs, that same direction can just as easily become the exact means of its undoing. This pattern is not unique to Ad and Thamud, and understanding the wider version of it explains why these two nations in particular have stayed so central to Islamic reflection on history.
The Quran repeats a structure across many nations. Extraordinary capability, a warning delivered by someone from within the community rather than an outsider, collective rejection rooted in comfort rather than confusion, and a consequence that lands suddenly rather than gradually. Pharaoh's Egypt, the people of Lut, the people of Mada'in, all move through variations of the same architecture. What sets Ad and Thamud apart is the sheer physical durability of what they left behind. Pharaoh's armies vanished into the sea. Lut's cities are traditionally linked to sites now submerged or heavily altered. But Ad's wind-scoured settlements and Thamud's carved valley are landscapes a person can still walk into today, which is exactly why the Quran invokes them
in Surah Al-Ankabut and elsewhere, with a direct instruction: travel through the land and see for yourselves how those before you met their end. It might be the only instruction in the entire text that doubles as an open invitation to modern archaeology. What makes this story endure, though, isn't really the archaeology, remarkable as it is. It's the pattern the Qur'an keeps insisting on, one that has nothing to do with whether you personally accept the theological claims, and everything to do with how civilizations actually behave. Ad believed their scale made them permanent, towering structures built as though height itself were a form of immortality. Thamud believed their craftsmanship made them secure, homes carved so deep into stone that nothing, they assumed, could ever reach them there. Both nations were told, by messengers who came from inside their own communities and spoke in their own voice, that mastery over stone and wind was never the same thing as mastery over consequence. Both chose to read their own success as proof they had already outgrown the need to listen. And in both cases, the end came not gradually, but suddenly, in the exact form of power each civilization had trusted most: a wind for the people who built the tallest towers on earth, a blast that shook the ground for the people who thought carved mountains made them untouchable. There is a reason the Prophet Muhammad, standing centuries later in the actual ruins of Thamud's homeland, did not tell his companions to admire the architecture. He told them to weep, or to hurry past with their faces covered, because he understood these were never simply old buildings. They were a message left in stone specifically so it would outlast the people who carved it, built to survive exactly as long as it needed to reach anyone still capable of hearing it. Nearly 1,400 years after that hadith was recorded, and roughly 3,000 years or more after Thamud is believed to have lived, tourists now walk through that same Saudi valley, and researchers still fly satellites over the deep sands of Oman, still tracing the same converging roads that Nicholas Clapp's team followed to a sinkhole in the desert. The wind that erased Ad and the blast that silenced Thamud were never really about two isolated tribes lost to time. They were the first recorded case in a document memorized word for word by hundreds of millions of people across 14 centuries of what happens when human beings mistake what they built for something that could never be taken away. Maybe that's why these ruins still pull people toward them, long after the languages spoken there died out, long after the empires that carved and recarved that stone all, one by one, disappeared as well. Somewhere between the towers Ad built and never got to finish enjoying, and the mountains Thamud hollowed out and never got to keep, sits a question every civilization eventually has to answer for itself, whether it has satellites and radar or nothing but sand and memory. What happens when the thing you were most certain would last forever doesn't? Modern visitors to AlUla now walk through Hegra's tune-lined avenues with guidebooks describing Nabatean burial customs, and researchers still occasionally publish new papers weighing satellite data from Oman against inscriptions from Jordan, arguing over exactly where Iram once stood. Both conversations will likely continue for decades, refined by whatever excavation comes next. But underneath the specific archaeological debate sits a claim that has not moved in 1,400 years, printed in the same words, memorized by the same generations, regardless of which trench eventually settles which coordinate. Two nations, given every advantage their era could offer, were told plainly that none of it was theirs to keep unconditionally. Neither believed it, until the wind came for one, and the ground opened for the other. The stone remembers exactly what the people who carved it chose to forget.
If this journey into one of the Qur'an's most historically grounded warnings gave you something to sit with,
Take a moment to like this video, drop a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe for more carefully researched documentaries exploring the history behind the Quran's stories of the nations that came before us. And if you're not done exploring the ancient world yet, there's another story from this same era waiting for you next.